This here is my late 1950s case Swingmaster that I've just taken the fretboard off of, and I've got the fretboard over here clamping that way when it's dry and cooled down that it's not going to warp into something insane that I can't work with. The reason I took the fretboard off is because the neck has a bow in it, which is common with just guitars in general, which is why truss rods are basically a necessity in every single guitar. But back in the 50s and 60s, truss rods weren't as widely used, and especially not in cheap guitars. So this, while not like super cheap, Ks were not the top of the line back then, and so they were department stores, stuff you could get from like a Sears or in a mail order catalog. So this one just has a steel rod running down it, which a lot of the times is why you see guitars that say steel reinforced neck. Old guitars will say that, and that refers to the fact that there is a piece of steel running down it, because the neck itself, the wood, is not sturdy enough to withstand the string tension. Some manufacturers thought it was, and they left it without a steel reinforced rod, and those necks are nearly unusable after being stringed up for 50 odd years. So the neck wood here is poplar, which was a common wood with K. Most of their necks are poplar. I don't think I've encountered one that isn't yet, but I typically work on the cheaper guitars. So poplar it's a good wood, but it's not terribly hard. It's not as hard as maple. A maple neck would offer more resistance to the string tension than a poplar neck does. So, hence the steel rod. And so, this right here is a similar steel rod. It came out of a K arch top that I also took the fingerboard off of. That one did not come out nearly as clean as this one because both the fretboard and the neck were made of poplar. So my tools kind of wandered off. So I'm going to have to do a whole lot of work on that guitar. But yeah, this one came out of that arch top. It's a pretty hefty piece of steel. And this one came out of a Japanese Taisco guitar. I went and took the steel rod out and put in a truss rod. And so this I've just kind of kept because it's good, because I can glue sandpaper to it. It's just generally a useful thing to have around. So how I got the fingerboard off was a combination of using this household iron, and I would rest the iron on the frets, which would then transfer the heat into the frets, into the board, and then into the glue that holds the neck on. The glue is hide glue, which is made from horses. Very common. I use fish glue because it's easier to work with, because you don't have to have the glue hot. So, went and I'd softened the glue, and what I did is I started this end here, and I'd go and take my knife and just work it in there. And you'll typically leave the iron on the board for a minute or two until you go and you try to touch the frets and they're really hot. And so I'd go and I'd work it in here, and I'd take my other knife and work that on top. The purpose of doing the two knife thing here is so this knife keeps you from cutting into the wood like I did with the other guitar. I got careless and I tore up the wood. So that I'm bummed about, but it's not nearly as valuable as this one is. So I'd go and I'd take that, and then I'd come from the other side, and I'd just work my two knives in all the way down until the board came off. That is not an easy task. It took me probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours to do it, which is why if you try to get work done on your guitar that involves taking it off, they're going to charge you a fair amount, because it's not an easy task. And what I had to do is, to prevent some of the finish from flaking off, most of it, is I'd take my X-Acto knife and just lightly score along the edge between the fingerboard and the fretboard, or in the neck. The fretboard is bound, so What I could have done is taken the binding off, and then it'd be so much easier, but taking the binding off to get the fretboard off means I'll have to put the binding back and hope it doesn't shrink, because it's old celluloid binding. So I just didn't do that. I just took it off, binding and all, and it came off real nicely. Took a while, but it did come off nicely. Don't have too much tear out, which is good. Tear out near the edges is definitely something you want to avoid, because that's harder. Like right here, I think I kind of dipped down a little bit. Luckily it's on the other side, but I'm still going to have to touch that up a bit to make it less visible. An important thing is when you reglue the fretboard, you want to have it perfectly aligned. And so what I did is, when I still had the board on it, I removed the first fret and then a fret down here near the heel, and I went and I drilled a hole here and a hole here through the fretboard into the neck. Those are going to be my alignment holes, and I drilled them just wide enough for my T-pin to fit into. So that right there is what's going to happen. So I'm going to take the T-pin and I'm going to stick it through the board into the neck, and that's how I'm going to align it. Obviously you want to make sure you don't drill too far. Like this hole here goes a little farther than I'm comfortable with, and this one is pretty shallow. But measuring is important, that way you don't drill through your neck, because that is a tragedy. And so what I'll do is I'll put that there, put another one here, put the fretboard on, and that'll keep it aligned really close to where it needs to be. And then I can wrap it and clamp it, and then it'll glue on and it'll glue straight. So steel rod here, I'm thinking of going about it two ways. Either one, taking my carbon fiber, which I got from Luthier's Mercantile. Carbon fiber is lighter than steel and more stiff, so it has less flexibility in terms of weight than steel does, but it is still kind of flexible. So I can either put a single rod down here and take the steel rod out, but I think I'm probably leaning towards, knowing how the carbon fiber does have some give, is drilling two parallel channels, and gluing in that. So these two carbon fiber rods will reinforce the neck, and of course I'll clamp it straight. I'll clamp it so the neck is perfectly flat, and then I'll route out my channels, and that'll keep the neck true as an arrow. And then when I glue the fretboard on it, it should also stay true. And then with string tension between this steel rod and these two carbon fiber rods, I highly doubt the neck is going to move. And to be on the safe side, I can even put a little bit of a back bow into the neck, just a very tiny amount, so that as the strings come and pull the headstock towards it, pull the neck into a forward bow, that it kind of evens out and you get a flat neck. There's mathematical ways of figuring that out. I don't know them, so what I'm going to do is just get it straight, put those in, and hope for the best. I would like to put a truss rod in it, ideally. Like, I've put truss rods in old similar guitars before, but the problem is this guitar is an arch top with a cutaway, and so there's no easy way to access a truss rod at this end. So if I was to put it, so as an example, I've got this guitar here. And this guitar, I've thought about, it does not have a truss rod, it's K built. I'm going to put one in the sound hole, so the truss rod will come down the fretboard, and then the truss rod nut will be under there, and you can easily get to it. With this guitar, I don't have that luxury. It's not, a truss rod nut would not be able to be easily accessible inside the body, and I'm not going to route out wood here to put in one up there, because then I'll have to make a little cover for it, which isn't a big deal, but I don't want to route out that clean wood. That's the original finish, so I want to leave that as untouched as possible. And so hopefully after all is said and done, this guitar will be super playable again. One good way to check if your guitar has a steel reinforcement is with magnets. These are 2 ceramic magnets I got from Home Depot. I wrapped them in electrical tape to keep them from flaking off and to keep them from really sticking to things. And you just take it and like that. So even through the fingerboard, so like this, you can feel some pull. And so through the fingerboard, you can just pop that there and you'll feel it. You'll know that there's a rod in the neck. The frets might offer a little resistance, but it should be pretty distinguishable whether or not it has a rod. Like right here, where the rod stops, there's nothing. Right here, I can lift the guitar up. Even better if your guitar has brass frets, because then the frets don't matter. They won't interfere with the magnetic field in any way. So, yeah, I'm going to let this neck settle. Probably clamp it to a straight edge as well. And then tomorrow, I think, I'm going to come at it and route my 2 channels and restore this neck.